Hi, this is Erin Tesh. I'm Managing Director of TSG. I'd like to start off by saying thank you to all of you for joining. Likely you're all in your home offices. We have a little over 150 folks participating in the call today. We had over 200 sign up, so I expect that we'll have more trickle in. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy during these challenging times. I'd like to introduce my colleagues that will be presenting today. Abigail Wacek is a Senior Regulatory Consultant at TSG. Abigail leads our federal regulatory team. Dr. Greene is a Senior Scientific Consultant at TSG and a key expert in our antimicrobials team. Before Abigail and Chris start their presentation, for those of you that are not familiar with TSG, I wanted to just say a few words about our firm. We've been providing companies around the world with regulatory guidance and scientific expertise for over 30 years. We help clients address technical and regulatory issues associated with taking their products to market in multiple jurisdictions. We have offices in the US, Canada, and throughout Europe, as well as partnerships around the world. We are part of Science Group, which is listed on the London Stock Exchange. We serve a number of key markets in industry sectors, including agricultural, industrial, consumer, food and beverage, animal health, and medical. Our teams are comprised of scientists and regulatory experts, many of whom have previously held positions at regulatory agencies and in industry. In fact, Abigail came to us from EPA's antimicrobial division. There's over 500 of us around the globe. We speak over 30 languages. We have 14 offices around the world and 2 dedicated R&D facilities. We do encourage you to submit your questions for the presentation via the chat function. We'll be monitoring your questions, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Also, as we are navigating this webinar with presenters that are not physically in the same room, so we think we've worked out all the kinks, but please be patient with us. So with that, I will turn this over to Abigail to start us off.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you all of us for joining. Thank you for joining. We want to start with a brief explanation of why we're all here. For many years, the market has relied primarily on chemicals to control pests. Devices have long been a small section of the market, especially for insect control. I think many are familiar with bug zappers. However, in the last few years, we have seen an increased interest in devices for control of other pests, such as microorganisms. Devices provide a non-chemical means of controlling pests, and consumers are always looking for alternative methods for pest control. There is also an increased interest by consumers for supplementing traditional pesticides with devices for use in controlling pests in hard-to-reach places. However, the regulations pertaining to the sale of devices can be confusing due to EPA's historically rather laissez-faire attitude towards devices, coupled with a market that is largely self-regulated. The goal of this webinar is to untangle some of this and to lay out the regulatory landscape of devices that mitigate pests. We will focus many of our examples for today's discussion on antimicrobial devices, but the general requirements we will discuss today are applicable to all devices, antimicrobial and conventional. So this is the agenda that we will be following today. We will start with an overview of FIFRA. We will discuss the definition of a pesticide device and EPA's device determination process. We will discuss the jurisdictional boundaries between FDA and EPA, and then the requirements for the sale of pesticide devices in the U.S. Chris will then step in to discuss challenges and claim substantiation with you before we end with our Q&A. So, FIFRA. FIFRA is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Under this act, the EPA has the authority over the sale and distribution of pesticides and pesticide devices in the U.S. Everything we talk about today related to EPA is regulated under FIFRA. Specific to today's discussion, under FIFRA, EPA regulates the composition, testing, labeling, promotion, distribution, sale, and use of pesticide devices in the U.S. I will note that devices are also regulated at the state level by a handful of states. We will talk about that process in greater detail later in this presentation. For now, we will focus on EPA. mentioned, for many years, consumers have relied primarily on conventional chemical-based products for disinfecting and sanitizing surfaces. These products are registered as pesticides by EPA. Any of you who may be familiar with chemical pesticides will already know that the registration process can be lengthy and expensive. Applicants must address a wide variety of data requirements and administrative forms. They must provide a label for agency review. They must pay a fee for service with a time and cost that can vary widely. And at the end of all of that, they end up with a notice of registration issued by EPA. Pesticide devices, on the other hand, are regulated but are not registered by EPA. So what does that mean? No administrative forms, no data submission requirements, no label review. But there are labeling requirements, and there are limitations on what you can and can't say, and there are requirements for import and export. It is these regulations that we'll focus on today to better understand what is required of you before you manufacture, sell, and distribute a pesticide device in the U.S. We will also talk about what isn't required, but what are some additional steps you can take to have more confidence that your product will not run afoul of any EPA rules. So, before we can talk about what a pesticide device is, let's figure out what a pest is. An organism is declared to be a pest under, quote, circumstances that make it deleterious to man or the environment. Common examples of pests include insects, weeds, and rodents. Specific to today's discussion, the definition of a pest also includes fungus, bacterium, viruses, prions, or other microorganisms living where you don't want them to be. Also for discussion today, pests controlled under the authority of the EPA are those in the environment, not microorganisms living in or on humans. Those organisms are regulated by FDA and are outside of the scope of today's discussion, so we will talk about more about that jurisdictional boundary. So, what is a device? A device is any instrument or contrivance intended for trapping, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest or any other form of plant or animal. A device does not include equipment for application of pesticides, such as tamper-resistant bait boxes, when sold separately from the pesticide. Devices are not required to be registered under FIFRA Section 3. For those of you who are interested, the regulation of devices were defined in the Federal Register in November of 1976. There are exemptions towards physical control of pests. These include guns, products that depend primarily on user performance, such as fly swatters, mouse traps, and as I mentioned, application equipment. So let's talk about some more specific examples. We'll start with the ultrasonic mouse repeller. Like ground vibrators used to repel gophers or sound generators used to repel pests such as birds, ultrasonic mouse repellents emit a sound at a frequency that humans cannot hear, but mice can. It drives them crazy and they run away. Pure, non-chemical pest control. Another example, drinking water filter units. The filter reduces or eliminates microorganisms from the water using a physical barrier that captures them. When we are discussing filters, I do want to point out an important distinction. As long as the filter is using a purely physical means to remove the pest, it is a device. However, if the unit contains any substance intended to disinfect the water, then the unit is a pesticide and that must be registered. Another bit more complex example are salt chlorine generators. A salt chlorine generator makes hypochlorous acid by using table salt and electrolysis. The salt water passes through an electrical current. The salt water is converted into hypochlorous acid and sodium hypochlorite, and those chemicals are used as sanitizers in things like swimming pools. The generator is not sold with a pesticide, but it is used for pesticidal purposes, so it's a device. The key difference here is that the generators can use any normal table salt and be effective. If a company sells salt for the express purposes of use in such a device, then that salt will require registration as a pesticide. So as you can see, the details of how you sell these types of products can really make a difference. To make it more complex, EPA's opinion and guidance does evolve. Ion generators, for example, used to be regulated as devices. But the agency's policy evolved, and in 2007, they clarified a key distinction between pesticide devices. The distinction was whether the pesticidal activity is due to physical or mechanical actions, or due to a substance or mixture of substances. The policy was related specifically to ion generators, which the EPA declared as no longer devices, but pesticides. Ion generators that use electrodes, for example of copper or silver, emit ions when a current is passed through. The incorporation of the electrode is what gave the ion generator its efficacy. As such, EPA determined that they acted as pesticides because they released ions and they did not destroy pests in a non-chemical manner. So, this is all getting rather complex. Water filters, we can all get. Purely physical means, definitely a device. But chlorine gas, ion generators, is that really physical? It all starts to get very confusing, and you don't want to get it wrong. So, EPA has given us something to help figure this out. Under the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, which is the fee-for-service program under which EPA obtains the resources to register pesticides, the agency has a review category for determining whether FIFRA registration is required for a proposed product. This category includes the determination on how EPA views your pesticide device and whether or not if it is a device or if it is a pesticide requiring registration. This fee category is optional. You are not required to submit, but it is a nice insurance policy when you aren't really sure whether or not EPA would agree that your product is a device. This can give you an answer in writing, one way or another, for better or for worse. But be warned that you may not like the answer. This category has an EPA decision review time of 4 months and 21 days and an EPA registration service fee of $2,482. You can apply for up to a 75% reduction in this fee if you are a qualified small business. The application will need to include some administrative forms, a complete copy of the label for the device, and a statement of all claims to be made on the product, as well as a detailed written description of how the product works to kill, destroy, repel, or mitigate a pest. Lastly, you'll need to submit a schematic diagram or detailed engineering drawings, diagrams, flow diagrams, or patent information. We have mentioned it a bit, but before I move on, I did want to talk about application equipment. According to EPA, pesticide application equipment that is sold separately from the pesticide itself is not a device or a pesticide. EPA gives the example of a sprayer for a lawn herbicide that is sold separately from the herbicide, which is considered to be application equipment, which EPA does not regulate. Another example would be a fogging machine in which you pour a hydrogen peroxide solution. Like a spray bottle, the machine is a way of applying the product. As long as you sell the hydrogen peroxide separately, then it is application equipment and not a device. I'd next like to talk about the jurisdictional boundaries between FDA and EPA. EPA has authority over products which claim to control pests in the environment. FDA has authority over products which claim to control pests in or on humans, or over instruments which are either introduced directly into the human body, either in contact with the bloodstream or normally sterile areas of the body, or contacts the intact mucous membrane, but which does not ordinarily penetrate the blood barrier or otherwise enter normally sterile areas of the body. Medical devices require pre-market approval with FDA. Pesticide devices are regulated by EPA. Sometimes this jurisdictional boundary gets very close, and for this reason you'll see some very specific language on products. For example, a UV device used to disinfect surfaces in a hospital room is going to be regulated by EPA. However, that same device used to sterilize medical equipment for surgery would be regulated by the FDA. Okay, so we've determined whether or not what you have is a device. If it is, what next? We're next going to talk about the requirements for sale of a pesticide device in the U.S. So we'll be talking about labeling, import and export, as well as state registration. What you see on the slide are the requirements for pesticide devices defined by EPA. To start, you cannot make any false or misleading statements. You cannot say that the product does something that it does not actually do. This includes efficacy. How do you prove it? Chris is going to talk more about that with you next. but short to say, you should have data on file demonstrating that the product is efficacious. EPA does not have a performance standard for this data, but you do need to have data. Your label must include the EPA establishment number. This means that the facility that produces the device must be registered with EPA. The process to register a facility is a pretty straightforward paperwork process. There are annual reporting requirements for pesticide and device producing establishments, but no fees. Please note that establishment registration is required whether the facility is foreign or domestic. Each establishment receives an alphanumeric code for the facility, and the number for the last facility to produce the device needs to be printed on the device label. The producer must register the establishment, report production annually, keep books and records, and subject itself to EPA inspection. Pesticide devices are also subject to child-resistant packaging requirements if the product meets certain toxicity thresholds. Import and export. Importers must file a notice of arrival with an EPA regional office. This may be filed electronically through Customs and Border Patrol's Automated Commercial Environment, or ACE system. Please note that this must be filed before the device arrives, and a copy must accompany the shipment. Do not wait to file this until your device arrives, or you will be stuck with a device that is not able to be fully imported. Exporters must use prescribed export labeling. The most important thing is that the labeling must be in English and in the language of the country of import, and otherwise follow the labeling requirements I've already discussed. We mentioned state registration in addition to FIFRA regulation. Device registration is required in 8 states listed on the slide. These are Colorado, Hawaii, Indiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Wyoming, and for the purposes of this discussion, we've promoted DC to the list of states. Different states have different registration requirements, and they change from time to time. Indiana used to require submission of the actual device itself. They have moved away from that as a requirement, though they still do reserve the right to ask for one. But most states aren't looking for more than your application form and your money, though you'll want to engage with your regulatory staff or your consultant prior to making any submissions. For 6 states, device registration takes about 30 days. For the other 2, typically about 6 months, though Indiana can take even longer, up to 9 months if data review is required. The cost to register one device in all 8 states is approximately $2,500. So we know what a device is. We know what we need to do to sell it in the U.S. But as you could tell, there are challenges. We talked about applicators and whether your product requires any FIFRA oversight at all, or whether you're outside of FIFRA. We spoke about how to determine if your product is a device or not by using PREA fee category M0009. We talked about EPA and FDA and whether your product is a device, a pesticide device, or a medical device. And we touched upon label claims and misbranding. You need to have data on file demonstrating that your product does what you say it does. If you want to say that your device is a disinfectant, there isn't any performance standard for that term for devices. Your best strategy is to mimic the performance standard for standard disinfectants to the best of your ability. To that end, I'm now going to turn the floor over to Chris for her to talk to you about claim substantiation. How do you show that your product is as efficacious as you say it is?
Thank you, Abby. So what we typically find is that most companies are unaware that the claims that they're making on their website or in their marketing materials are actually considered deceptive or false advertising in the eyes of the EPA. In most cases, companies will see an immediate need that they feel their product can speak to. It actually advertising in order to appeal to these customers who are really just seeking a solution in a field where there often isn't an easy answer. We're seeing that happen right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. But what the companies don't realize is that the test data that they have on file or that they have done already really does not support the statement that they are now making or trying to make in their new advertising. So for example, an environmentally product that claims it's biodegradable when in fact only components within the product are biodegradable, or making a health claim such as protects against COVID-19. For a product that kills viruses from a surface, you can't make a public health claim like that. And what you would need is a lot of toxicological studies as well as some clinical trial data to support a public health claim, such as curing a disease of some sort. And then there are blanket statements such as kills in 30 seconds or safe and effective. These are blanket statements that are made without any qualifying remarks. So in other words, you can't say it kills in 30 seconds without qualifying the statement regarding to the organism that it applies to, and then exclude all the longer kill times that are required for all the other microorganisms. So that's considered deceptive. Now, there's a reason why this is a problem. First, next slide, please. First, it can be difficult for consumers between false advertising claims and from true ones. And many companies will leverage this special claim in order to support selling their product at a premium. So in other words, people are paying for expectations that a product that will not necessarily meet. But more important to either of those is that the claims often can have an impact on public health. So in an effort to help ensure that consumers are provided with accurate information and to protect human health, government bodies are united in taking measures to protect consumers from deceptive practices and false advertising. For pesticidal devices, these government agencies are both the EPA and the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission. Now, the EPA has guidelines for pesticidal devices, specifically in Section 2Q1A of FIFRA, which affirms that a pesticide or a pesticidal device is misbranded if, quote, its labeling bears any statement, design, or graphical representation which is false or misleading in any particular manner. So there's a number of characteristics that this encompasses. These range from safety-related claims, effectiveness or efficacy statements, statements regarding endorsement by a federal agency, true statements that could be used in a misleading manner, as I just showed you in the previous slide, or they don't, they don't want you to show comparisons to other products, right? So comparing other products to your own, even if these are comparative safety claims. So both the EPA and the states have the authority to enforce this. And the FIFRA violations cost about $27,000 per shipment. So as you can imagine, this can get pretty expensive. But most companies should be equally concerned about the FTC, because the FTC does have the authority to police anti-competitive and unfair and deceptive acts or practices. And let me explain to you why. Currently, companies are policing, for the large part, they're policing each other. They literally turn their competitors into the FTC. So this can cost companies a lot of money as well in fines, and it also runs the risk of having your products pulled from the market. So how do companies go about substantiating product claims for pesticide devices? Now, product claims are substantiated with data, and the data that you need is dictated by the claim that you want to make. For example, a safety claim would require an exposure or risk assessment. An efficacy claim would require the development of a study protocol or following some predetermined approved method, and that study would then be executed in a microbiology laboratory. So many companies don't have their own scientists on staff. You can always hire someone to help you understand what your data requirements are, and then develop a test protocol to produce that data. So it's really important to be smart about study design and methodology before testing is performed. You should define the parameters of the testing, and this includes both your positive and your negative controls. You'll want to ensure the appropriate quantitative data will be produced, as it's important to know how that data is going to be analyzed in advance of the test, because Statistical methods that you intend to use will also have data requirements. And just a quick example, a chi-square test that uses frequency data. A t-test uses quantitative data. And of course, the statistical test that you intend to use ties right back to the claim that you want to make. So the point here is to do your homework before you spend the money to have the tests run in the lab. Now, when it's all said and done, the results can then be submitted to the EPA for review. Now, the EPA, not the FTC, conducts the data review for these devices making pesticidal claims. What's interesting is that many companies, many that I've worked with, have already performed efficacy studies of their pesticidal devices in order to prove the efficacy to their customers, to their clients. So all they now have to do is to take that data and submit it to the EPA for review under the PREA fee category A521. So the EPA will take about 4 months and 21 days to complete their review. And they do charge a fee for this. It's $4,963. And that does sound like a lot, but it is a lot less than the headache and cost of being under FTC scrutiny. So it's worth it. Despite the fact that these review categories have been established under PREA 4, what's interesting is that very few, if any, submissions have been made to the EPA. And this could be due in large part companies being nervous about receiving EPA guidance that might be unfavorable to them. However, enforcement is fairly low for pesticidal devices. So companies really need to make a business decision. They apparently seem to want to take the business risk and sell their product without EPA confirmation, which is a business decision. I'd like to share with you a couple of examples of how companies have tested their devices in order to support their claims. So this is an example where the manufacturer produces a device that uses UVC and ozone to disinfect the soles of shoes. Their target market is hospitals and healthcare. Now, their sales team found that most of their customers wanted evidence or data that the device actually worked and that it killed certain microorganisms that were relevant to them. They wanted independent test data. So in this case, a comprehensive laboratory test was devised that used human volunteers in the lab where they were able to simulate typical body weights and shoe materials and actual use, and 8 different microorganisms that were significant to the healthcare environment were tested. So compared to controls, the results showed a greater than 3 log reduction demonstrated for 7 out of the 8 microorganisms. In fact, the end result was greater than 4 log reduction for a couple of those microorganisms. So it was at least a 3 log reduction or better, which for UVC was pretty impressive. So a manuscript of this study had been drafted and it's submitted for publication to the American Journal of Infection Control, where it is currently under review. So the point is, not only will this publication be great for the company from a marketing and BD perspective, but the results can also be submitted to EPA for validation. In this next example, the manufacturer wanted to show that they could effectively disinfect bedpans, which are commonly contaminated with C. difficile and other enteric pathogens in hospitals. And the difficulty of testing this in the field includes the inconsistency of potential contamination from one bedpan to the next, along with it's difficult to confirm that the bedpan has contamination that you're looking for, specific, say specific to C. difficile in the first place. So again, a comprehensive study was developed and executed in a lab, which required, in this case, installing the washer disinfector in the lab for testing. Real use conditions were attained by contaminating the bedpans using simulated soil that was inoculated with the C. difficile or E. coli. And the results were a 3 log reduction for C. difficile and a greater than 4 log reduction for E. coli. These results were drafted, submitted, peer-reviewed, and have recently been published in the American Journal of Infection Control. And there's a reference there at the bottom of the slide if you're interested. So again, not only will this publication be great for that company from a BD perspective, the results can be used to submit to EPA for validation. So those are pretty high-level overviews of studies of pesticidal devices and how the results can be used to achieve multiple goals. Now, there's a number of really good reasons why manufacturers should ensure that their pesticidal device claims are validated. Not only will you have EPA-validated claims data to present to the FTC should they come knocking at your door, but now you also have evidence-based science to present to your customers and to your stakeholders. And this builds brand trust. I've seen a number of cases where the data actually told a positive story that the manufacturer didn't even think of before, right? Which then gave them a new edge in that market to pursue. So this data can be turned into communication pieces for marketing, business development teams, allowing you the assurance for proper advertising and overall positioning in the market. With the right data in hand, companies can arm themselves with evidence-based science to confidently communicate a product's unique benefits and value while simultaneously satisfying that regulatory need. So it's a win-win, two birds with one stone. Now there are a few points, some key takeaways from today's webinar that I do hope that we've communicated to you. First, it's really important to understand that yes, there are regulatory requirements that are associated to pesticidal devices. And unfortunately, pesticidal devices do not have to meet the same level of scrutiny and rigor that's required of a chemical disinfectant. And as a result, it has become somewhat of a wild, wild west out there with respect to product claims associated to those devices. And there are some challenges. For example, it isn't always intuitive to know if your device falls under the jurisdiction of EPA or FDA or both. Is it a pesticidal device or not? But really, one of the biggest challenges that I see is understanding how to go about substantiating that claim. This is largely because, for the most part, widely accepted standardized test methods and protocols don't really exist for the variety of device types that are out there. And with we have a lot of new novel technologies that continue to be developed. So efficacy protocol development can be a bit of a daunting task for most people, but there are places you can go to for help with that. And lastly, it's important to recognize that the opportunities are bigger than satisfying the regulatory obligation. It provides confidence in marketing and BD efforts, and it helps you build brand trust. And in many cases, these studies help companies demonstrate leadership in their space. So I strongly encourage validation of pesticidal devices. And with that, I will hand it over to back to Erin. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Abigail, for this very informative presentation. I think there's often a misconception that since devices don't require federal registration, that they're not regulated. And clearly, based on this presentation, we know that's not the case. I suppose, given the current pandemic and the proliferation of devices entering the market to mitigate public health pathogens, claim substantiation is more important now than ever. And Chris, I appreciate your comment about it's often competitors that turn each other in, but I would caution companies to make sure your own house is in order before you turn in a competitor, because EPA does have a practice of looking at the company that's raising the complaint as well as the company making the potential false claims. I guess as the saying goes, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So TSG can help and has been helping companies for many years with compliance issues associated with pesticide devices. As Chris mentioned, there's a lot of new novel products being developed all the time. We can help sort out whether the product is in fact a device or a pesticide. We also assist companies with obtaining establishment numbers, state registrations, and as Chris has indicated, we can help with substantiating their efficacy claims. So I'd like to now address some of the questions that that people have been sending. Let's see. Let's go to the first question is, okay, so this presentation is on the U.S. What about Canada? What's required in Canada?
So, wonderful question. Canadian federal registration is required under the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, or PMRA. I will need to confirm additional details with my Canadian colleagues, but federal registration is required. I don't believe that registration is required in the provinces.
Okay. Another question. My device contains several components from various countries, and it's assembled in one location and then labeled in another location. Do I need to have an EPA establishment number for each location involved in the entire process? Abby?
It's a very common question, and I'm happy to address this because there's a lot of confusion here. The establishment number on the label of the device is the establishment number for the last facility to produce the device. Now, production does include actual manufacturing as well as packaging, repackaging, labeling, and relabeling. So if you produce your device in multiple facilities, each of those facilities does need to be an EPA-registered establishment, but you only need to have the establishment of the last facility to produce the product have their number printed on the label. Both facilities must report production. This is not redundant. EPA is very common. And must file annual establishment reports.
Okay. Let's see. We have another question about, does EPA work closely with PMRA?
Not particularly. For devices, no. The two agencies do not generally talk to each other with regards to pesticide devices or even pesticides as much as they say that they do. No.
So this is a question that came up a few times, actually, and I'm going to try to summarize multiple questions into one question. So if a device says, for example, and I think this one would be geared towards Chris, so if a device says sanitizer, for example, does that mean it needs to meet the same performance standard as a chemical sanitizer? Meaning, does EPA apply the same efficacy performance criteria to devices as chemical products?
Thank you for that question. It's a good question. EPA really has not established a performance criteria for devices. We do advise companies to try to establish that same performance standard as their chemical counterparts. But pretty much, no, they haven't established criteria for devices specifically. And that's one of the key components of that study design on the front end, is understanding what kind of data requirements are you trying to achieve and what do we need to do to achieve that.
Okay, great. We have a lot of questions. I'm hoping to get through as many as we can here. All right, my device is manufactured outside the U.S. Does my establishment need to be registered, and generally, how long does it take to get an EPA establishment number?
Yes, your establishment does require registration, whether it is located foreign or domestic. The process to register the establishment begins with first obtaining a company number for the company that owns and operates the facility. That can be submitted via email, and that process does not have a stipulated response time from EPA, but we typically see turnaround in about as little as about 2 weeks. Once you have your company number, then you can then file the paperwork to register your establishment. If the facility is located within the U.S., then that registration is filed with the regional office in the region where the establishment or your headquarters are located. If your establishment is located outside of the United States, then you will file that registration with EPA headquarters. The process, again, does not have a stipulated response time from EPA. It does vary. Typically, the regional offices are a bit quicker than headquarters, and the time of year is also critical. Establishment reports are due March every year for production the previous year, and so response time is typically slowed in the spring. But generally, I would say registration for your establishment can be processed in about 30 to 60 days, perhaps 90 for a foreign establishment submitted in March.
Okay, another question sort of crosses the line of FDA versus EPA. So if a UV device is used for medical equipment surfaces, does it require a 510K, an FDA 510K?
Yes. Yes, if it's going to be used on medical devices, then you will require a 510K to be submitted with FDA.
Okay, let's see. I sell a water cooler that has UV component. I don't make any claims on the unit, and it's NSF certified. Do I need to get an EPA establishment number and comply with pesticide device requirements?
If the product does not make any pesticidal claims, then it does not trigger the requirements for pesticide device, for the pesticide device.
Okay. How do I know which bugs I need to test against?
Whatever bugs you're going to be claiming on your label. So, Chris, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah. Like Abby said, what the bug you want to claim on your label is definitely the microorganism you want to test against. Sometime, so really it's where are you going to use your product and how is it going to be applied? So there are specific microorganisms that would be important and speak to your, if it's healthcare. If you want to say, like in the example I gave, that it kills C. diff, well then you would want to include C. diff as a microorganism. So since there are not protocols specific for devices necessarily, what we really want to do is look at the market that you want, that you're enter, and then find the microorganisms that speak to that particular market.
Okay, so this has to do with efficacy as well. Let's see. Do the states use EPA 810 guidelines when reviewing efficacy data submitted during state registration? Abby?
Sure. So the 810 guidelines, for those of you who are not familiar, are the efficacy performance guidelines that EPA has established. There are different guidelines for hard surface sanitizers and disinfectants, for laundry sanitization, for water treatment, etc. These are the guidelines that are followed by, we'll say, the standard pesticide applicants. Pesticide devices are not required to follow the 810 guidelines. Those guidelines were written with chemical pesticides in mind, not pesticide devices, although they may be a good tool for you to follow when you're trying to make those claims. As we mentioned, EPA and the states don't really have a performance standard for terms like disinfectant and sanitizer. So the 810 guidelines are a good place to look when you're trying to figure out how to closely mimic what EPA would be looking for a chemical pesticide to make those claims.
So this is a related question. Because there's no performance criteria for devices, does EPA regulate device claims such as sterilization versus disinfection versus decontamination?
No. It's a short answer. Again, the agency has not defined any of those terms as they are related to pesticide devices. For those familiar with chemical pesticides, you'll understand that those terms are very, very tightly regulated with specific organisms, specific contact time, and many other testing requirements. Those standards are not applied to pesticide devices. I do caution companies when they are looking at making those types of claims on their pesticide device to be aware of that. You must have data on file to support your claims. And some of those claims, especially in certain use sites, can carry quite a bit of weight. And so if I was considering a claim like that, I would want to make sure I had substantiated my claim with data, and I may even consider going to EPA and having EPA review my data to get that assurance.
Okay, I'm not entirely, I think I'm going to take this question, and I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but would a chemical used in barrier packaging be considered a device? I think the answer would be no, it would not be considered a device. Okay, let's see. Another question has to do with air filters and air purifiers. So two related questions. One is, are air purifiers that claim to eliminate harmful bacteria considered a pesticidal device?
As long as they're relying on purely physical means, if it's an air purifier that relies on a filter or an ozone unit or an ionizer, then yes, that would be a pesticidal device. But if that air unit is relying on some kind of chemical substance to contribute to the efficacy, then that would be a pesticide.
So what about the replacement filter that goes into an air purifier? Would that require an EPA establishment number?
So the replacement filter, and again, this is for a device, as long as that filter is not treated with any chemicals, no. The filter by itself is not a pesticidal device because it can't work without the machine in which that filter goes into. So that would not require device labeling on that replacement part.
Okay, what about, is there an exemption for monitoring traps?
So monitoring devices are exempt, but you mentioned traps, so I want to discuss that monitoring devices are exempt. Traps, if they're purely physical, then those are also exempt. But if the traps include pheromones or other chemicals to, let's say, attract insects, or to trap or mitigate or do anything against any organisms, then those do require registration as a pesticide.
Okay. All right. This has to do with efficacy testing, I'm assuming. Do claims need to be made using GLP? I'm sure the data to be generated under GLP and verified labs.
So Abby, yeah, go ahead, Abby. I think go ahead.
Absolutely. So I think this ties back to the fact that there is no performance standard. So I would recommend using a GLP facility. I do think that provides weight to your data and again, some assurance in the validity of those claims. But EPA does not have a requirement, and the states do not have a GLP requirement for data.
Some of these have to do, some other questions have to do with very specific products in terms of chlorine generators, on-site generators, which get to be a little bit more complicated. Do you want to just speak briefly about precursor chemicals and on-site generators?
Absolutely. So this is a very complex area, I'll start by saying, and one where there is not a whole lot written down by EPA. So the guidance that we do have is based on experiences with EPA as well as some, kind of ever-changing registration of some of these products. So in general, the EPA does, if a chemical is sold with a device or is sold with language that it is for use with a specific device to have a specific pesticidal effect, then that chemical does require registration as a pesticide with EPA. That would be something like if I wanted to sell a specific salt mixture for use with a specific generator, then my salt would require registration with EPA as a pesticide, and my generator would require regulation as a device. Now, if I'm not selling a particular chemical for use with a particular device, if I am instead selling a device and I'm telling you, my customer, to go find whatever salt you want, I don't care, go get a Morton salt and pour it in, then that salt is not being sold with the purpose of being used as a device, it's sold as salt. And so it's not going to require registration as a pesticide. And again, how you sell these precursor chemicals with your device makes a very big difference, and this is something I actually was involved in a discussion about 2 weeks ago with the state of Indiana about a pesticide product that was registered and is for use with the generator, and the question was actually whether or not the generator was a device or an applicator, because they weren't sold together. And in that case, Indiana had determined that that applicator was, that generator, for lack of a better term, was an applicator. So claims are critical, how you package it is critical, and these details are something you definitely want to parse apart before you get into this.
So I think we're going to be closing out here. I appreciate your questions. I do realize that we haven't answered all the questions, and I'm sorry, but please reach out to TSG directly. We'd be happy to continue to answer those questions. I think, I wanted to thank everybody for participating. One of the questions that we got actually several times is, will this presentation be available by email? And absolutely. And wait, there's more. We actually prepared a paper on this topic that is hot off the presses, and we will send that all to you, the paper, as well as a recording of this presentation, and as well as the slide deck. So thank you all for participating. I hope you have a great day.